Great. Hello friend, we've got this lovely big ash log here and we're going to chainsaw mill it up and try some new things with the saw. Let's get to it.
This is an enormous turnip moment.
Hopefully we'll pull the whole log over. According to the Handbook of Hardwoods, published in 1972, the strength of ash increases about 40% as it dries to 12% moisture content. In our experience, the blunting effect is possibly even more than this, and because this tree was standing dead for a good few years before it was cut down, I'm expecting we'll have to pull out all the tricks to get some decent boards from it. Sure enough, even though we painted the ends right after felling, the beginning of this first cut is quite a lot more sluggish than I'd expect from, say, a greenwood log. Indeed, in a log that's been sitting a while, it can be well worth cutting about 6 inches or so off either end, especially if they're cracked anyway. It can really save a good bit of chain blunting kerfuffle, as you see from this first straight establishing cut. We opted not to do that. As per usual, we're adjusting the mill height to allow for the depth of the ladder. Lots of people don't use the straight edge after the establishing cut, and sometimes even we don't, but it's much better to use it, and we'll go into why as we go on. Assuming the first cut went okay, it only takes one quick screw in the end to hold it on adequately. Most of the chainsaw milling we do is out in the woods, but this log is right by the workshop, so we're collecting up as much of the sawdust as we can. It would usually just be left to nourish the soil there.
Boing, boing.
We've done another video on buying and fixing up the backhoe, and after spending goodness knows how long tinkering with it, it sure is satisfying being able to use it like this. Now we're gardening our way down to more respectable sized slabs. Let's break out some chain lube. Here's the auxiliary oiler. It's an old fuel mixing bottle. It's got a very rudimentary shut-off and needle valve, and it just comes down to a point right by the chain where basically the oil has nowhere else to go other than onto the chain that's returning into the cut. So any oil that's got flung off the nose should be replaced by auxiliary oil here, and we're only doing that because this is quite dry ash. Of course, using filtered waste vegetable oil. Oh my. What you see here is how the ladder is really useful as a staging area for the beginning of cuts. Without a ladder or straight edge of some kind at the beginning and end of cuts, only half the mill is supported, and it's by far the most dangerous and tricky aspect of milling. This is probably the sweet spot in milling most logs. The height is just nice, you can kind of sit on the log as you go along, and assuming the chain is sharp and you've angled the log slightly downhill, things can go really quite smoothly. I often get the question of how tight to make the chain, and it does make a difference to the quality of cut you'll get when chainsaw milling. The simple answer is, with the chain brake off and it all set up, I want to be able to move the chain by hand without too much difficulty, but I don't want to see a lot of sag. I just want that. You'll see at this stage things are a bit more awkward and more hunched over and between standing and crouching, and the real tip to this video fixes all that. Let me just interrupt myself for a moment to tell you about a book that Sam and I wrote. It goes into pretty much every element of chainsaw milling in quite some detail, including plans to make your own chainsaw mill from off-the-shelf parts, just like the one we're using here. It's not expensive, it has lots of valuable information, so if you're interested in chainsaw milling, check that out on our Ko-Fi page. We often get asked why we don't use a winch when we're chainsaw milling, and the main answer is gravity-fed milling. There's two elements to this. One is that you set the log up on a slight incline, and the other is what you see me setting up here. With a couple of carabiners, a retired climbing rope, and a weight, in this case an old bare branch, we can easily rig up a consistent, continuous horizontal force to help us do milling. Not only does this allow you to have a straight, comfortable posture, but you no longer need to stop to put wedges in, which can lead to a smoother finished board. It was a real game changer when we sussed out gravity milling. Even if, for whatever reason, you can't incline the log in the direction you want to, you can get a smooth, consistent pull to the mill, perfectly tuned by cutting the right size counterweight. This really frees up some time and cognitive bandwidth, so you can focus on how the cut's going, what the auxiliary oiler's doing, whether or not you should be putting wedges in, all that kind of thing. A winch might be somewhat easier to initially rig up, but when chainsaw milling you do tend to have trees around that you can use for this kind of thing, and even if you don't, it's very likely there'll be a bit of structure or possibly even a boom of a backhoe that you could use to rig a similar thing up. The rope wants to be tied so that as or just before you reach the end of the cut, the counterweight is hitting the floor and so stops dragging the saw. Evening sun is showing up every single detail of the ridginess, but there's no real washboarding as such. Yeah, very pleasing. Even here, where typically I'd expect some ridginess, it's pretty good. Apart from not having to baby it the whole way like a winch, another thing I like about the gravity-fed method is that it doesn't pull any harder if it encounters resistance. One of the common pitfalls with chainsaw milling is ploughing on after the chains become blunt. Most people's natural inclination, mine included, when things start to slow down is just to want to push a bit harder. Unfortunately, in chainsaw milling, that's a terrible strategy, and not only will you get really tired, but so will the saw, guide bar and chain. Yep, nicely finished. When you're finishing up on a log and you're this low down, you've got to be quite careful not to hit any part of the ground. Doesn't matter if you're cutting through log supports, but it can often be well worth lifting the whole thing a bit higher at this stage. That's especially true if you're not using a gravity-fed method. I hope you take this trick, friend, and use it. It's worked really well for us. I'm not saying chainsaw milling is ever going to be easy. It certainly is good exercise, but this method lets you do it with better posture, and the results are much smoother boards. If you found this useful, consider shouting us a coffee over on Ko-Fi or even checking out our book.